My name is Rodalinete, and the title of my project is the Emergency Surveillance System. So it's a system that records emergencies of civilians and contacts the appropriate public service in proximity. So it works with an AI system and an app. And when an emergency is issued, the AI system sends the location of the emergency to the public service so that they can um, arrive early on the scene. And also the public services that the project focuses on is the police service, the health service, national fire service, and NADMO. So to the ER diagram, the users have to either be a civilian or a respondent. And for the civilian can write one or more reviews, and then a review has to belong to a civilian. And also a civilian can upload one or more videos on the emergency, and a video has to belong to a civilian. And a review also belongs to an emergency, and an emergency can have one or more reviews. And also, in when an emergency occurs, like maybe the user can see that there's a fire outbreak, but there could be the emergency can have one or more situations at the same time, and also a situation has to belong to an emergency. An emergency type also can have one or more situations, and the situation can have one emergency type. Um, for the for the respondents is in one or more emergency respondent team, like those who go to the emergencies to help solve the problem. And an emergency can have one or more emergency respondents. And also, a public service has one or more branches, and a branch belongs to one public service. And a branch can have one or more respondents, and a respondent belongs to one branch. And the respondents can also write one or more reports, and the reports can be written by one respondent. So from the ER diagram, I was able to come up with my logical table, my logical table. So for the we have the user ID, which is the primary key, and the other non-key attributes like first name, last name, and birth dates, and so on. And the civilian references the user ID. So it's a foreign key inside the civilian table, and it has the other non-key attributes. The emergency entity also references the user ID from the civilian entity, and also has its own primary key, which is the emergency ID. So the emergency video also has its own primary key, which is the video ID, and it also references the emergency ID from the emergency entity, which becomes a foreign key, and as well as the other non-key attributes. And the situation ID also has its primary key being the situation ID, and the foreign key it references the emergency ID from the emergency table. The emergency type also references the situation ID and the emergency ID from the emergency table. So this table consists of foreign keys. And the public services also has its own foreign key, which is the service ID, as well as an other non-key attributes. And then the branch ID has its own primary key, and it references the public services ID, which is the service ID, as well as and it also has its non-key attributes. And the employee ID has a foreign key, which is the employee table has a foreign key, which is the employee ID, and it references the um, branch ID. And the emergency respondents reference both the emergency ID and the employee ID. Now the reviews also um, reference the user ID because it's the user that's giving the review on the emergency. So it also references the emergency ID. And the reports is done by the respondents. So they also reference the report is done on the emergency. So the report table references the emergency ID as well as the employee ID. So the SQL keys that I used were not now, which mostly occurred in the which was mostly for the primary keys. All the primary keys do not have not now, right? And they have the constraints as well. For the user table, I used also increment, so it generates the user ID for it. And also for the tables that reference keys from other tables, I use the foreign key, which has the um, key that is referencing, and then the table is referencing from. So indexes, for my indexes, I was only able to do three indexes. So the first one, seek to the system needs to know the location, address, and intensity of the emergency to contact the public service closest to locate the civilian. So this is the query that I use to solve this. This is the query for it. So it selects the emergency location and it labels it as the emergency location. It also selects the emergency status and all the emergency status, like that's the status of the emergency and the intensity of the emergency and the contact. Yeah. And it takes it from the emergency table and it also joins the branch. It joins it to the branch and the situation table, so they're able to know which public service when attended to this emergency and also the situation, that's the intensity of the situation. And for the next query, um, the team, the service needs to know the team which attended to the civilians emergency. So I selected a team from the emergency respondents and I joined this I picked the the employee ID from the respondent table. Yes, I was able to join, and I was supposed to pick the user ID 133. So it's looking for the team which responded to the emergency of the user with the ID 133. And when you run it, it gets the team. So Team Solace attended to the user with the ID 133. And for the last query I did, the respondent needs to know the medical status of the civilian. So I selected a medical condition from the civilian table, and I selected some of them do not have medical conditions, so they have none in that part of the table. So when you run it, it gives you those with medical conditions. Yes, and these are my indexes. So I was able to create an index for the emergency table, the medical table, and the situation table. Thank you.